Italy, a founding member of the European Union, is openly forging stronger ties with China, potentially defying its closest European allies. What does this mean for the future of the EU? Is Italy risking its place in Europe to secure its own path? Let's rewind a bit. Not too long ago, the EU imposed tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, citing unfair subsidies. In retaliation, China didn't just respond with general economic sanctions. No, they hit Europe where it hurts, targeting sensitive industries and regions, including Italy's key markets. And this wasn't just a political maneuver. It exposed a growing divide in Europe. Italy's leadership saw China's precision strikes and felt the sting. So what's their response? Is Italy quietly suggesting it's better off cooperating with Beijing than aligning with Brussels? But if that's true, what does this mean for Italy's economy and for Europe's unity? China's tariff strategy zeroed in on Europe's food industry, one of Italy's major exports. In 2022 alone, Italy exported over $4 billion in agricultural products to China, from olive oil to wine. Now imagine that access disappearing overnight. By targeting food, China's message to Italy was clear. Stick with us, and your economic interests will be protected. And Italian farmers? Many are questioning the EU's stance on China. For them, it's not just about economics, it's about survival. But this raises a critical question. How far is Italy willing to go to protect its economic interests? Italians have a deep connection to their land, their produce, their exports. So when Italian farmers see the EU risking trade ties with China, they're forced to ask, whose interests are really being served? La Repubblica recently reported that nearly 65% of Italian agricultural exports rely on open and favorable trade agreements with China. Italian farmers are rightfully concerned, and their pressure is reaching Italian policymakers, fueling Italy's pivot toward China. Farmers are questioning Brussels' approach, and Italian leaders are listening. So, why exactly is Italy openly defying EU norms and strengthening ties with China? Please like and subscribe. Your support helps us grow. Thank you. Italy's leaders see opportunity. They're aware that the EU, bound by collective decision-making, often moves slowly, stalling on policy adaptations that could benefit Italy's economy. China offers Italy a chance to sidestep those delays. According to Il Sole 24 Ore, Italy's Foreign Minister Antonio Tajani recently stated, "We are forging a path for Italy's future, a future that values our economic independence as much as our alliances." Italy's government is positioning itself as a trailblazer, an independent agent within the EU. They're signaling a willingness to prioritize Italy's unique economic needs over the EU's broader agenda. But what's in it for Italy? What strategic advantages does President Mattarellas' visit to China offer? President Mattarellas' visit wasn't just a diplomatic courtesy, it was a strategic move, aiming to deepen ties in key industries like green energy, technology, and manufacturing. Italy wants more than just trade. It wants a partner in growth. Italy's Ministry of Trade reported that new agreements could increase Italian exports to China by 15% within the next 3 years. The benefits? Jobs, technology sharing, and direct investments into Italy's most essential industries. By aligning itself with China, Italy is betting on a diversified, resilient economy. But Italy's bond with China runs deeper than recent economics. It has roots stretching back centuries. How does Italy's unique historical bond with China play into today's geopolitical landscape? This isn't Italy's first rodeo with China. The roots of Italian-Chinese relations go back centuries to Marco Polo, who journeyed through Asia, establishing a legacy of exchange and cooperation. Today, Italy is reviving that legacy, not as a curiosity, but as a strategic link to the East. Historian Luca Pacioli once described Italy's early ties to Asia as a relationship built on mutual fascination and commerce. And Italy is drawing on that legacy to present itself as China's gateway to Europe. With these strong cultural ties as the backdrop, could Italy's pivot signal a shift in EU-China relations? Italy's close relationship with China is causing friction in Brussels. For the EU, unified foreign policy is a hallmark, but Italy's pivot suggests that not all members are on board with the EU's hardline stance against China. Polls by Politico EU indicate that support for independent China policies is rising in other EU nations, with over 40% of respondents in Greece, Portugal, and Spain favoring closer ties to China. Italy may just be the beginning. If more nations follow suit, the EU's policy on China could start to fracture. And for Brussels, that's a nightmare scenario. But this isn't just speculation. Italy's trade with China has already surged to $70 billion. So, what could this mean for Europe? Here's a fact that's difficult to ignore. Italy's trade with China reached a stunning $70 billion, and it's only expected to climb. This isn't just about exports. It's about a strategic partnership built on mutual gain. Italy's exports to China grew by 20% over the past 5 years, fueled by demand for luxury goods machinery and automotive parts, according to Reuters. What does that mean for Europe? Italy's surge in trade with China could set off a ripple effect, encouraging other EU nations to reconsider their economic alliances. The message is clear. If Italy can expand its economy through direct ties with Beijing, why can't others? But with the EU pushing back against Chinese imports, particularly in the tech sector, could Italy's alignment with China create even more division? Recently, the EU slapped tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, claiming unfair trade practices. But here's the irony. Italy, with its automotive sector, is one of the countries that could be hit hardest by these tariffs. Italian car manufacturers, especially in the luxury and electric segments, rely on parts and raw materials from China. Industry experts argue that these tariffs could disrupt production and drive up prices for Italian consumers. For Italy, this isn't just a policy issue. It's an economic one. The question is, can Italy afford to follow Brussels' lead if it means risking its own automotive industry? And beyond cars, which Italian sectors could thrive with deeper ties to China, and which might struggle? Italy's economic ties with China go beyond luxury cars. Key sectors, fashion, agriculture, and higher education, are seeing a boom thanks to Chinese partnerships. Italy's iconic fashion brands, for instance, are rapidly expanding into Chinese markets. According to Bloomberg, Italian luxury exports to China grew by 30% in 2023 alone, as the country's middle class continues to seek premium European goods. But not everyone stands to gain. Italy's small and medium-sized businesses, particularly those in local manufacturing, face competition from cheaper Chinese imports. And for these businesses, deeper ties with China could mean stiffer competition. This raises an interesting question. Is Italy's public behind this push for closer ties with China? Public opinion in Italy is as divided as you might expect. While some view the partnership with China as essential for economic growth, others worry about dependency on a global superpower. A recent survey by La Stampa revealed that 54% of Italians support closer economic ties with China, seeing it as a pragmatic choice in an uncertain global economy. It's clear that Italian leaders are sensing this shift, but public opinion matters, not just for Italy's leaders, but for the EU's larger strategy. If Italy's citizens back closer ties with China, it could embolden other EU nations to reconsider their own stances. And speaking of EU stances, could Italy's diplomacy create a new template for EU-China relations? Italy's relationship with China is testing the boundaries of EU diplomacy. While the EU prefers a united front, Italy's approach could offer a more flexible model, one that combines economic pragmatism with strategic autonomy. Dr. Federica Mogherini, former EU foreign policy chief, observed that Italy is attempting to walk a tightrope, balancing EU loyalty with national interests. If Italy's model proves successful, it may influence other EU nations to pursue similar bilateral relationships. Imagine a Europe where nations engage China independently, each on their own terms. But what kind of message does this send? Is Italy, by prioritizing China, signaling a shift away from EU solidarity? By strengthening ties with China, Italy is sending a message that its own economic growth comes before European unity. It's a bold stance, one that suggests Italy isn't afraid to chart its own course, even if it means parting ways with Brussels. Italy's GDP growth forecasts have been revised upwards by Italian economists due to increased trade with China, according to Financial Times. This shift is more than symbolic. Italy's willingness to prioritize its own economy could embolden other EU countries to question the value of strict solidarity on global issues. And in a world increasingly concerned with sustainable growth, how might Italy's relationship with China reshape ideas about cooperation? Italy isn't just eyeing China for trade. They're pursuing partnerships in sustainable growth. From green tech to energy-efficient manufacturing, Italy's government has made it clear they see China as a key partner in building a greener future. A recent partnership agreement between Italian and Chinese firms aims to develop solar and wind energy projects that could provide energy to over 1 million homes in Italy. This collaboration suggests a new type of relationship, one that looks beyond the typical trade narrative and instead focuses on sustainability. Italy is promoting a bold idea that cooperation and engagement with China can be more beneficial than the isolationist stance some EU members prefer. This approach challenges the EU's often cautious or confrontational stance on China. EU economists have noted that a cooperative relationship with China could increase EU GDP growth by an additional 1.5% per year, according to a study by The Economist. If Italy's model proves effective, it could push the EU to reconsider its broader China policy. And if that happens, Italy may become a bridge linking China to Europe on cooperative terms. But will Italy's approach inspire others or create fractures within the EU? Italy's strategy is being watched closely. If successful, it could set a precedent, encouraging countries like Spain, Portugal, and Greece to explore similar partnerships with China. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz recently remarked, "Europe must be open to diverse relationships that serve each member's interests." So Italy's actions could trigger a domino effect, prompting a new era in EU-China relations, one where independent strategies coexist with collective policies. But could this approach come at a cost? Could Italy's bond with China destabilize traditional EU alliances? Italy's unique relationship with China risks unsettling traditional EU alliances. By acting independently, Italy may be sending a message that the EU's approach to foreign policy can be more flexible than previously thought, and that nations can pursue their own interests, even if it means moving away from EU consensus. Jean-Claude Juncker, former president of the European Commission, once stated, "The strength of the EU lies in its unity. But that unity is tested when individual members seek bilateral relationships that deviate from the collective strategy. If Italy continues down this path, we could see fractures within the EU, as each member state reassesses its loyalty to EU principles versus its own national interests. And Italy's bold diplomacy doesn't just rattle the EU, it's a challenge to the geopolitical balance of power with the United States. The United States has long been a key influence in shaping Europe's stance on China, urging caution and unity. Italy's growing bond with China directly challenges that influence, suggesting that Europe can engage with China on its own terms. According to a Washington Post report, the US has invested billions in diplomatic efforts to discourage EU nations from forming direct, strategic alliances with China. Italy's deviation from this stance raises questions about the future of transatlantic influence. By choosing cooperation over confrontation, Italy might be nudging other European nations to see that they don't have to follow Washington's lead. And that choice could ripple across the entire geopolitical landscape. Which leads us to the question, could Italy's approach with China mark a turning point in global power dynamics? Italy's pivot towards China could signify a monumental shift in global power. Traditionally, European countries aligned with the West, especially under the influence of the United States. But as Italy finds new allies in China, it hints at a new world order, one where power is more balanced and diversified. According to an analysis by Foreign Policy magazine, if more European nations adopt Italy's approach, China could emerge as a key partner to Europe, fundamentally altering the global balance of power that has been US-centric for decades. This isn't just about Italy or China, it's about the future of global alliances. Italy's strategy could serve as a blueprint for other nations, signaling that the world is no longer a two-player game of the US and China. Instead, it's evolving into a multipolar system where nations carve their own paths. Italy's decision to strengthen ties with China isn't just about bilateral trade. It's a calculated gamble that could reshape alliances, redefine the EU's future, and challenge global power dynamics as we know them. Italy's story is one of independence, of seizing opportunities where others see threats. And while the EU debates the merits of unity versus individual sovereignty, Italy is already blazing a trail that could redefine Europe's relationship with the East. Italy's move has left the world watching, waiting to see if other nations will follow suit, or if this path will lead to consequences we haven't yet imagined. So, what's next? Could Italy's gamble pay off in ways that reshape the global order? Or will the EU and its allies find a way to counter this new alliance? We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe. Check out another video that is now on your screen.